You're listening to Mistreated. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Historically, we've been told that autism is something that mostly impacts boys and men. But a recent study from February 2026 shows that autism is almost as prevalent in girls as it is in boys. The difference is that girls are often diagnosed much later in life. On today's episode, we speak with Julie M. Green about what it was like to be diagnosed with autism as a mother at age 44 while also raising a child on the spectrum. She documents this experience in her book, Motherness, a memoir of generational autism, parenthood, and radical acceptance. Julie and I talk about the history of autism and why girls are often underdiagnosed and misdiagnosed. We talk about what a refrigerator mother is and why they were once blamed for autism in children. Surprise, surprise, when in doubt, blame the mother. Julie also speaks out against the harmful stereotype that people with autism don't feel empathy and why she's concerned about autism becoming the boogeyman of our times. Julie joins me now. Could you please introduce yourself, Julie?
Sure. My name is Julie Green. I'm a writer based in Kingston.
You wrote this really beautiful book called Motherness, a memoir of generational autism, parenthood, and radical acceptance. Can you tell us more about what prompted this book?
Yeah, kind of twofold, really. The real impetus came after my own autism diagnosis. So my son was diagnosed at 3, and then 10 years later, I finally got an inkling that I might also be autistic. More on that later, but it took 10 years in the process. And then I was 44 at the time, which is quite late, but it turns out quite common for women to find out late in life. And there was this process of sort of, I guess, this post-mortem, well, sounds morbid, but looking back through my life and all these situations that happen in relationships and through a new lens now that I had that understanding that I was autistic. Um, so through all that analysis, I was also thinking, well, how does that compare with my son? Where there's so many similarities, there's such overlap, but yet there's so many differences as well. And that just gave me kind of the structure, an idea for the book. So the way it is structured is that it alternates between my experience of parenting my son from the time I was pregnant till he's 13. And interspersed with that are my own experiences. And I've broken it down by, I guess, autistic traits or things that we would associate with autism. So comparing, for instance, his experience with sensory issues compared to mine. And it also sort of highlights all the ways that we're different and similar. Because everyone knows autism is a spectrum, yet what comes down to it, we still, I think, expect everyone to for it to
Present
show
in one
up the
way.
same.
Yeah.
Yeah, to present in one way. So
You've mentioned a lot of things that I want to do follow-ups on to, including the fact that you find out that you're on the spectrum at age 44. But I wanted to just talk a little bit about the title of the book. I think the word motherness is so interesting, and I wanted to ask you, what does that mean? What is motherness?
and I had to fight for this title because, publishers and people don't take kindly when you want to make up a word. How dare you? But to me, it was like the perfect, mashup to this whole idea of being othered, and having grown up feeling like you don't fit and you don't know why. You just do have this sense that you are other. Um, and even the sense, I guess, as a mother raising a child with a disability, there's also an othering there where you're often isolated, um, at a certain point, don't really fit with your peers who are raising typical kids. You feel like you can't join in the same events, or it's quite stressful. People don't really understand what you're going through. So there's that whole side of otherness as well, that I talk about. because even aside from me being autistic, there's this whole journey of raising an autistic child. And a lot of the things that I found, even within the autism community, weren't really talked about that often. And I know certainly in the early years with my son, I felt extremely isolated, very alone, a whole range of emotions. And it wasn't that it was always this tragic narrative that we see. It wasn't terrible. We had a lot of fun as a family and everything, but we also I felt quite cut off in a lot of ways. So I wanted to explore some of that as well because I had not really seen myself in other books. So I guess it was the first, or is to my knowledge, the first memoir of a parent who is autistic, as a woman who is autistic as a parent who is also raising an autistic child, because we have memoirs by autistic advocates who by and large don't have children. And then we have the memoirs by the parents uh, raising autistic children, but nothing really, I think, that combined those experiences, which is increasingly common now, where a lot of parents are realizing their own neurodivergence through their children and not earlier.
That is so interesting because it's this experience. I mean, when you become a parent, it's already kind of like, oh, this is not like you really have to be in it to understand it. And then now you're in it, but then you're feeling this sense of like otherness, correct?
Yeah, this would have been around 2012. We weren't nearly where we are with autism awareness. I mean, the internet wasn't quite what it is now. You didn't have all this information at your fingertips. You didn't have all these forums and communities where you could learn about autism or by autistic advocates. So it was a very different place. It was basically, I felt like, you had a social worker, you'd get the report saying, yes, your child has this diagnosis. Good luck, off you go. Get the services. And, my partner and I knew virtually nothing about uh, autism then. So it was a really steep learning curve. And there, at the time, it was all about my son. And there was no inkling even that, it was only very slowly that certain things I understood about him intuitively.
Mm,
And I thought, okay, like maybe there's something to that.
mm,
I understand. I want to cover my ears and I understand why he can't wear this, but he can wear that. And,
mm.
um, but then there were so many differences too that I just pushed it in the back of my mind for many years. And I was too busy, honestly, just learning about him and just is deep in the weeds, in the reeds or whatever, to even consider anything about myself.
You mentioned that you and your child shared a lot of different things, including face blindness. And you write this. I've taken out the swear words, but you write this. Between my emotional state and my facial expression lies a disconnect. A flat, a flat or vacant stare may make me appear bored or even hostile when I'm simply concentrating. I may look downright peed off when I am rapt and attentive. In other words, I have chronic resting bee face.
Neat. Mhm.
Well,
Neat.
this admission made me laugh out loud because it's relatable, but it also felt heavy. Writing a book is one thing, but having to promote it and do interviews is another. What has this process been like for you?
Yeah. I'm lucky in a strange sense that, we have the likes of Zoom these days. And because people will say to me, "Oh, your book tour." And I'm saying, "Well, no, there is no tour." By design. I've made it so that I've done a lot of these sort of appearances. Radio and podcasts are forgiving. Like I'm stimming off camera. It's a lot more comfortable. I don't have to leave my home. It eliminates a lot of elements. Still very, very grueling, and I've had to be quite conscious about how I schedule things. And because I've had phases where I've been getting close to burning out. I'm trying to be more conscious about being authentic and not trying to mask, but there's still naturally an element of, this is quite tiring and social, even though technology helps a lot. So yeah, because autistic people, and I mean a lot of writers, not even autistic people, but authors tend to want to be introverted, and we do this private solitary work, and then suddenly in the age we're in now, you're expected to go out there, be everywhere, and making reels and promoting yourself and being a brand, and it's very uncomfortable, and like just this idea of being perceived is something a lot of autistic people struggle with, myself included, but it's also a necessary evil.
You mentioned masking, and I want to come back to masking. I want to talk about how you got to know this diagnosis. You wrote for years that you sat on the fence about getting assessed with autism. At 44, you finally get assessed. In the book, you write this: "You are autistic," the doctor says now. "Impossible. I can't be on the spectrum," is your first thought. "I am not Rain Man, Sheldon Cooper, or even Temple Grandin." And Temple Grandin is a scientist and activist who wrote The Autistic Brain. What I thought was really interesting, at this time, you are raising a child on the spectrum. So looking back, can you describe what it felt like to get that diagnosis and also why you reacted that way?
Yeah, well, like everyone, all we have are the stereotypes, and that's all I knew of autism for the longest time, until the only inkling that maybe made me start to consider it was meeting another late diagnosed autistic woman. And I thought, oh, wow, okay, you mean autism doesn't have to look like Rain Man, Sheldon Cooper, and even Temple Grandin. So those people weren't, it was a rare thing, and it was the first autistic woman I had interacted with. She was another parent, and we'd met through sort of the blogosphere, as it was called back then. um, and then finally one day, I just broached the subject with my doctor, who luckily didn't gaslight me and say, oh, well, you have friends, don't you? And you can make eye contact, so you must not. Because I know a lot of women approach it and they are shot down. But fortunately, I have a doctor, and she was receptive, and she put me forward for the assessment. And then I kind of forgot about it in a way. And then a year later, my name came up in the wait list, and obviously then had the full uh, assessment done. And so in a strange way, I'd been mulling over the possibility for a very, very long time. So it was weird. So when the actual words were delivered and you get that report, um, it was like relief. Like finally, I know for sure that's what it is. And I expected it, but also it was like, oh, then you're reading the report and you're like, well, really, in a way, I kind of didn't think I was.
Mm.
And then you're reading the scoring and you're like, oh, okay, interesting.
For you to finally like understand who you are, what was it like to fully understand, like to get you to know yourself perhaps for the first time at age 44?
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. So many people rally against labels, but it's, you know what? You get these other labels. If I'm not calling it autism, then I'd internalized a lot of other labels, like you're very rigid, or why are you this way? Um, why are you such a princess? Why can't you handle this? Why can't you cope with that? And so I'd internalized a lot of that, and it just creates a lot of problems with my mental health, quite honestly. So I think it's a shame it's this late in life, but and I still catch myself because it's very hard to unlearn what you've believed all along. So I will have to try to catch myself now and say, well, no, you can't handle that because this, because of your difference, your neurology, it's not a character flaw. So it does kind of take time. It's a work in progress to try to get sort of rewrite those old narratives.
So um, I think historically there has been this perception that autism mostly impacts boys, and what you are sharing with us, it's showing some of the harm that can come out of girls not being diagnosed. And you wrote. I wanted to read something that you wrote in the book. You write this. Ever since Austrian American psychiatrist and physician Leo Kanner first described, quote, early infantile autism in 1943, the face of autism has been white, cis, and male. It's not that autistic girls and women did not exist. We have always been here, hidden in plain sight. Why is it important to broaden the understanding of what the face of autism looks like?
Well, it's so important, like for the reasons I said as well, because what's happening is not that autistic girls weren't existing, we were missed, and so many of us are diagnosed later, and we're not getting any, we're not getting, we've gone through childhood, adolescence, whatever, early adulthood without any understanding or support. So that's obviously crucial on a lot of levels. So in terms of mental health, we're often misdiagnosed, which is why, it's such a perfect theme for your podcast. So frequently women or girls were diagnosed with depression, which is kind of a comorbid thing, but it doesn't tell the full picture. Or often things like borderline personality disorder, also very common. Um, and also health, we tend to have other health conditions like I talk about in the book a lot, migraines in my case. There's now like proven correlation. We have issues with some gastrointestinal issues. There's a higher incidence of like eating disorders, reproductive disorders, endometriosis. There's like a much higher incidence of this in autistic women. So if we're not realizing that these women are autistic, then not only are they not getting mental health support, because we're not labeling it, giving it the right name. We're also not really understanding and viewing, getting them the support for the medical conditions that we have in tandem with autism. So we need to sort of see the full picture. Um, so yeah, and not least of which that people are growing up sort of full of self-loathing and not understanding who they are when they can be advocating for themselves, they can be getting to know what they need to be healthier and happier. So I think that's vital at any age. But, as you say, it's trying to revamp the research and the science, because if all the research was just involving these young white boys and how that version of autism presented, then even the diagnostic criteria now needs to catch up. There may be, I think, a new test that actually measures masking. So I think they are trying to take steps to redress that, because, of course, women and girls will continue to be missed if we're using diagnostic criteria that was solely aimed at the presentation of autism for boys,
Um,
or a very select presentation.
you've mentioned masking a couple of times. What is masking?
Yeah, it's I think a lot of people imagine it's like acting. It's not a conscious thing so much as um, a way of being safe, um, and fitting in.
Mm.
So in my case, a lot of it is mirroring. So in my case, it was like being quite mute and shy and observing and trying to copy things, copy how you've read. Girls, I used to read a lot of books. It actually is probably the reason I became a writer. I got very into reading novels because I was actually studying how people act. So a lot of people will also watch TV shows and try to learn and copy and mimic people. So they'll try to, make the same kind of nonverbal gestures. Scripting, we often rehearse rehearse conversations or certain phrases that people use. It's like a very stressful and unnatural thing to do, but at the same point, those of us can do it, um, are safer in a way because we can pass. We can pass for typical. We're not standing out. So our autism is more invisible and it's not as obvious. But the cost of that is a lot of just chronic stress and these conditions, I think, on the nervous system. I kept getting sick all through my life, and I still do, but I have a better understanding of it now. Um, but that kind of dysregulation in your nervous system catches up with you, and it often leads to burnout.
It's heartbreaking what you're saying, because you're aware that you should be behaving in a certain way, which goes against how you feel in your own body. You mentioned a few times the differences, because I think when we think of someone being on the autistic spectrum, we think of maybe how boys present, someone who is maybe having a tantrum somewhere. Maybe they're just a child. But anyway, we have these ideas in our society of what it looks like. What are the differences in how girls present with autism when compared with boys?
Yeah, and that's part of the reason. Masking is like a big part of the reason that girls do get missed because we have this ability. So a few things would be that we're more socially motivated. So someone might say, well, you have friends, but well, if you scratch the surface, you'll see that there's a lot of like striving. We might still get a lot of social things wrong. Um, we may rehearse these conversations or constantly like misstep, and there's still a lot of social confusion, but we may actually have a friend. Our interests can be a little more conventional. So we still have quite intense interests, but it might be like that we're really obsessed with Barbies or cats or horses or whatever. So sometimes the interests don't stand out because they're very much in line, or like say a pop star or something like that. So that wouldn't really stand out among other girls in our peer group. But again, it's kind of like the the intensity and the level of it, where it's like the cataloging and just the level of interest. I think about it now, like I've always been really into music, but lots of people are into music, but I would literally have hundreds of things and I'd have it all alphabetized and cataloged. And it was all like a real, um, that points it, gears it a little bit to something a bit more autistic. But the other thing too, as I said, is just the gender bias element that boys tend to show their autism in a more external way, whereas when girls are distressed or struggling, it tends to be more internal. So as I said, a lot of eating issues, a lot of sensory issues, so the big difference with my son and I, and a lot of girls versus boys, is the boys, I mean, girls would have meltdowns too, but my son would have these huge reactions where, aggression, throwing things, breaking things, massive explosions, whereas a lot of girls would have things called shutdowns, where they would just pretty much curl into a ball, break down, or not be able to speak for a while, like have to retreat and recover from any social outing. Um, so, it's things like in school, the girls wouldn't get much attention because you'd put your head down, you'd want to please, you'd do your work, but it doesn't mean you're not struggling. It's just less visible.
This is Mistreated, and you've been listening to our conversation with Julie M. Green. Her book, Motherness, is a memoir on raising a child on the spectrum and receiving an autism diagnosis herself at age 44. We'll get back to it shortly, but I want to take some time to examine why girls on the autism spectrum have historically been ignored and how that's changing. For decades, researchers studied autism symptoms in boys. The first description of autism is credited to Leo Kanner, an Austrian-American psychiatrist who referred to it as, quote, early infantile autism in 1943. A year later, in 1944, Hans Asperger separately described a similar condition, and it became known as Asperger's syndrome. But that name has been clawed back after allegations that Asperger collaborated with Nazis during World War II. And according to the UK's National Autistic Society, quote, what was referred to as Asperger's syndrome is part of the autism spectrum and there is no need for a separate term. In the 1980s, autism became recognized as a neurodevelopmental condition that existed on a continuum. That's when the term autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, emerged. Today, advocates call for using words like condition or neurological difference to remove the negative associations with the word disorder. While labels might change over time, there's one thing that stayed the same. The symptoms of autistic girls have not been widely recognized. A paper from 2022 reveals that, quote, nearly 80% of girls with ASD are missed. And in February 2026, a study from Sweden published by the BMJ suggested that autism may occur at similar rates in males and females, but boys are 4 times more likely to be diagnosed in childhood. This study found that by the age of 20, diagnosis rates of men and women were almost equal. And the lead author of the study, Dr. Caroline Fife, said, quote, our findings suggest that the gender difference in autism prevalence is much lower than previously thought due to women and girls being underdiagnosed or diagnosed late. According to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, that's because, quote, girls with ASD have less well-recognized symptom profiles or higher intellectual ability, better language skills, and perceived better social skills. But these perceived better social skills are often a result of girls masking or camouflaging their symptoms, as they also often do with ADHD. Aid Canada, a national nonprofit that shares resources on autism and other intellectual disabilities, says that, quote, 90% of females have engaged in camouflaging. This behavior may make it harder to identify autism in female-presenting people. Some autistic people credit camouflaging for their social and vocational successes, as they experience less stigma and marginalization in these spaces when their autistic traits are less pronounced. But camouflaging is exhausting for the individual and is a risk marker for suicide. Camouflaging also prevents or delays diagnosis for autism and can reinforce how sex and gender often shapes health outcomes for people with autism. Getting a timely diagnosis can help to identify additional conditions. Girls and women on the autism spectrum are more likely to experience seizure disorders, gastrointestinal disorders, headaches and migraines, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, endometriosis, autoimmune disease, asthma, and food allergies. Studies also show a connection between autism and PCOS, now PMOS. And a timely diagnosis can also help individuals better understand themselves. A 2023 study found that ASD and neurotypical females had a comparable number of sexual experiences they later regretted. But ASD females were 2 times more likely to have consented to an unwanted sexual event compared to their neurotypical peers. While research is catching up with reality, there is still so much misinformation. Back in September 2025, U.S. President Donald Trump blamed mothers taking Tylenol during pregnancy for autism. And this wasn't the first time that mothers have been blamed for this condition. In the 50s, so-called refrigerator mothers were blamed for being emotionally cold and causing their children's autism. In the 1990s, a doctor blamed the MMR vaccine for causing autism. Even though his paper was retracted and his medical license revoked, the belief that the measles vaccine could cause autism persisted. While Canada successfully eliminated measles in 1998, we lost our elimination status in 2025. Back to Julie now to talk more about refrigerator mothers.
People just love blaming mothers generally. It's just so easy, isn't it? Some people blame mothers all the way into adulthood. Yeah, so this was, I guess, in the 50s, they didn't really understand anything about autism. They didn't understand that so much is hereditary. So of course they made this connection that, well, mothers who were emotionally cold ended up causing the child's autism. And it took quite a while for that idea, for, research and science to disprove that. And it just took hold for way longer than it should have. And that's
Well, the
yeah.
solution for that, the solution for this refrigerator mother was something called a parent talk to me. Parent talk to me.
Mm.
What is that?
I see you're taking me back. It's been a while since I've written and done all this. That was some children were actually forcibly removed from their families, which you can only imagine how horrific that is now. And the point is, too, many of these mothers maybe weren't performing motherhood in the way that it was. Many were probably autistic, quite honestly. And they weren't performing motherhood in maybe the way that was expected. So they were assumed to be emotionally cold and they had their children taken away. It's shocking.
I have a few more questions to ask. I wanted to spend a little bit of time on the chapter on empathy because I thought that was just so beautifully written. You're right. One of the most hurtful stereotypes about autistic people, there are many, is that we lack empathy. It's not that autists don't care about others. We care tremendously. It's more that we don't always enact empathy according to the world's standards. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, and again, this was, I think, something I had internalized as well. Because I mean, some people don't show it in conventional ways. Some people have too much of it, or I feel like it's misplaced or it doesn't come out in the way that's socially acceptable. And I talk about it in the book. For instance, I lost my grandmother that I was very close to, but I felt I didn't react much at the time. And I was very hard on myself, thinking, like, what is wrong with me? Am I a monster? But sometimes it's just processing times and just the way we process things is different. So I think what they have proven as well, I don't think the research is in the book, but in terms of, oh, and I'm going to get it wrong, there's two types of empathy. So one is how you experience empathy, and one is sort of how you act empathy. So autistic people were found to show exactly the same levels of, experiential, whatever, I forget the actual term, of empathy, whereas where we were different was in the way we were performing it and showing empathy. And of course, though, people are like so quick to judge if you're not displaying empathy in the right way, then you look cold, or you look unfeeling, or you look insensitive, um, or you just look like melodramatic. And like, I had a really difficult time when I lost my pet, and autistic people tend to be just as attached to the people, our animals, as they are with our people. But I was thinking, this is just so off kilter. I'm way more destroyed and grief stricken over my dog than I am on my grandmother. But it was all just in different ways and shapes that it came out. And you get a lot of shame around that. And I internalized a lot of shame, thinking I'm not performing empathy in an accepted way. Is either way too much in a way, or for over something that I shouldn't be feeling so much about, or it's not enough, or it's just not on the right timeline. Um, and that's unfortunate. We just have so many social constructs around grief and what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. Um, and that's unfortunate, because again, this is something that's really dogged autistic people, and a lot of people, I think, still really buy into that idea that we lack empathy.
I want to read something else that you wrote. You write, Autism became the boogeyman of our times, the worst possible thing that could happen to your child, a fate apparently worse than death or disfigurement from some hitherto eradicated disease. Parents became fierce and outspoken opponents to vaccines and other supposed toxins in their children's diet or environment. As usual, moms found themselves at the forefront of what appeared to be a moral crusade. Having done the research for this book and also being a mom on the spectrum with a child on the spectrum, what do you think is most misunderstood about autism?
Oh, wow. Um, Gosh, there's so many. I mean, the empathy was the big one that we touched on. I mean, just the capacity of, what's possible, that we're complex humans like anybody else. And unfortunately, a lot of the times in the media, we're not portrayed that way. And I think unless people have someone who's autistic in their lives, and they really see them as multidimensional people, we're stuck with these stereotypes that someone's a savant, um, some amazing neurosurgeon or whatever, or on the flip side, that we're just a blight on humanity. And you don't want to read the comment section on some things, because unfortunately people will still say this. Like, I would hope my child is dead than has autism. Yeah, I've read it. It just shows that for all the awareness and all the forward progress we feel like we've made in terms of neurodiversity and this movement, there is still a long way to go. And a lot of people, unfortunately, are still holding on to a lot of very backwards ideas, and would sooner have us back in the ages of having people institutionalized and not having people out there.
Whew, well, you
Um,
do write about this
yeah.
fear, and I want to read one last passage from the book. You write, "What scares me most are other people, other children, teachers, parents, politicians. Autistic people face an increased risk of being bullied and victimized. Those who are non binary or gender non conforming are further marginalized, experiencing poorer physical and mental health, less access to health care, and a greater likelihood of sexual assault, sexual harassment, and verbal harassment compared with the general population." As a mother and also a person who has done the research, what do you say to someone who thinks they may be on the spectrum and may or may not also be raising a child on the spectrum?
Well, that's the hard thing, right? We live in really scary times, and it can be tempting to just sort of bury your head thinking you're going to protect your child from harm, and by not stigmatizing them. But the fact is, they're going to be stigmatized anyway. People pick up on difference. I know from just being in my son's class in kindergarten, people would run up to me. I was volunteering just as a means to sort of help him and support him. And all these children were coming up to me as young as kindergarten going, why is he doing that? Why is he answering me? Why is he being like that? They knew right away, like, people just latch on to difference right away. And if we don't call it what it is, there'll be other names, they'll be bullying, they'll be called a freak. Um, so it was important for me to have those conversations with my son and with other kids that I encountered, to try to lay the groundwork to say, yes, you know, he absolutely is different. This is sort of how he ticks, and this is why it's like we always likened it to like a different operating system, like Mac versus Windows or whatever. Um, as opposed to, because the more we try to ignore this, people will just be othered. And I don't know, I think the more we normalize it, and we have people, autistic people, who are visible, and we can generally really see it as a spectrum, and hopefully it'll be less stigmatizing. I mean, that's why I wrote the book. I mean, parents, all want to protect our children, but you can't protect them from the world. And it is quite scary now that it does feel like we're going backwards in so many respects. But a lot of people think differently. So we have to keep talking about it and making autism visible.
Well, thank you so much for writing the book. I think it's
Mhm.
going to expand the conversation. And it's also goes into history as this is something that happens and has happened. My last question to you is that for most of your life, you've been judged for who you are, but you were probably the hardest on yourself. In the book, you wrote that, quote, I screwed up. I always screwed up. In what ways did writing this book help you to understand yourself better?
It's difficult. Memoir is such an interesting thing because people are like, oh, how did you deal? Like the parts, the parts that were the most difficult to write were also the most cathartic to write. So in a lot of ways, revisiting some of those instances from my own childhood or, adolescence, early adulthood, um, I think it really helped me to look back on that girl or young woman and just give her more grace and compassion. And I think get back to that place before I felt othered, before I realized I was different and kind of cut myself off because I mean, that's what I would love. Like my son doesn't really mask. He is who he is, which, for better or for worse, like in some ways it would be easier if he could mask, but it's not healthy. And I love seeing that he's his authentic, funny, like there's so much humor in the book because he's so funny. Um, and I just think that is such a gift that I would never want someone to have to put themselves into this like metaphorical box, and it's very hard, but I'm trying to get out of that box now and to get back to the person I am. Uh, and if you lose yourself if you've grown up not feeling you could be yourself, you don't even, and you've masked so long, you don't even quite know who is that person. So it's this whole process of unlearning.
Julie, it's been really lovely having you on the podcast. Thank you so much for making time for us. And in the book, I think the chapter on Elvis had me like laughing out loud. Thank you so much for taking time to speak with me.
I'm
Is there
so
anything
glad.
else that you'd like to add?
I'm just so glad to be here, and it's really great to talk with you.
This was Mistreated. Thanks for listening. You can follow our show wherever you download your podcast so you can get notified each time a new episode is available. We would love to hear your feedback. You can write me an email at mistreatedpodcast@tvo.org or reach out to me on social media. Thank you for all of your emails and comments. We appreciate the response to the podcast. I'd like to read a comment from our episode on how endometriosis behaves like a cancer. Sarah writes, thank you for holding this conversation. I'm 31 years old and I've been suffering for 18 years. I just had my surgery last month and properly diagnosed with stage 3 endometriosis. It's been a struggle. I'm happy to have an answer, but I'm grateful for the healthcare professionals who are listening to their patients and willing to learn and find new paths for us to heal and manage this. Thank you for having this video. This week's episode was produced by Tiff Lamb and me and edited by Colin Kish. Digital shorts by Ariana Longley, camera work by Max Stussy and the TVO studio crew. Teleprompting by Christy McLeod. Production support from Jonathan Hallowell and TVO's digital media services team. Lori Few is executive producer of digital. Vanessa Case is vice president, media. Thanks so much for listening.